She collapsed on the sidewalk of Tremont Street, the paintings scattered around her like fragments of shattered dreams. A stranger caught her before her head hit the ground, his expensive coat torn at the shoulder, his calloused hands marked with old scars, and his eyes carrying the weight of a dark past, the gaze of a man who had once been the right hand of a Mafia family, now running for his life after a betrayal. What Claire Bennett did not know was that the man who had just saved her was fleeing from his own existence, and she, a street artist clinging to her last breaths, had become the only reason he stopped running. Winter afternoons in Boston were never kind to the fragile. The wind slipped through the cracks between old stone buildings, cold enough to sink straight into the bone. Claire sat curled against a corner of Tremont Street, near the entrance of an aging convenience store, where passers-by seemed to care only about their phones and the warmth of the coffee cups in their hands. In front of her sat a small rack of oil paintings, landscapes that carried Claire's quiet soul. A sunrise at the harbor, a field of wildflowers, an autumn afternoon glowing gold in the public garden. Each painting had a handwritten tag in marker, $50, or whatever your heart allows. No one stopped. No one asked. She had been there since early afternoon, wrapped in a worn coat whose lining had thinned to threads. A wool hat hid her bald head, the result of chemotherapy, and a beige scarf covered her pale skin. Every gust of wind made her shiver, but she didn't dare leave. Not when she was $200 short on rent. Not when her next chemotherapy session was scheduled for Monday. Not when her bank account held only $43. Claire had done the math. Even if she sold all her paintings, 8 in total, they still wouldn't cover a single treatment. But it was the only thing she had left to offer. To paint and to hope. A sudden wave of dizziness struck as she stood to adjust her display. Her vision blurred into streaks of light, the sound of traffic fading as though she were sinking underwater. She heard canvases falling, the rustle of fabric, and then her knees buckled. No, not here, not in the street, but her body no longer obeyed. Everything collapsed. And then a firm arm wrapped around her, stopping the impact with the freezing pavement. She heard a low, gravelly voice, rough like stones grinding together. "I've got you. Don't push yourself. You're very weak." She forced her eyes open. A stranger's face came into view, deep gray eyes, a jaw sharp as a blade, messy black hair, and dried blood on his sleeve. He wore a black wool coat, the kind Claire had only seen through the windows of upscale malls, but this one had a long tear across the left shoulder. There was the smell of blood, gunpowder, and something else like sea wind mixed with tobacco. Claire panted, struggling to steady herself. "I'm fine," she lied. "Just tired." The man looked at her, his sharp gaze sweeping the street as if expecting danger at every corner. "When did you last eat?" he asked. "I don't need—" "I'm not asking out of pity," he cut in. "I need to know if you can stand." Her heart thudded out of fear, embarrassment, or something else she couldn't name. "Yesterday," she whispered. "Maybe yesterday," he hissed under his breath, eyes flicking over his shoulder like a hunted wolf. Then he looked directly at her. "I need to get out of here. You need to not pass out in the street. Help me, and I'll help you. Deal?" Claire should have refused. She should have yelled. She should have called the police. But she was too weak, too alone. And those eyes, a desperate honesty that cut deeper than she expected, made her nod. "Okay," she murmured. "Help me carry the paintings. I live above Gianna's bakery, 3 blocks north." The man nodded. One arm steadied her while the other gathered her paintings as if they were something precious. And so they walked, through the crowds, through indifferent glances, a frail, bald woman leaning on a man who looked as though he had stepped straight out of the back cover of a Mafia novel. 2 strangers, 2 broken pasts, stepping into each other's lives in a moment neither of them could have predicted. If the moment Nathan drew his gun and stood in front of a nearly complete stranger makes you hold your breath the way I did while writing this, if you want to know what waits behind that barely open door, an enemy, a past, or a secret far more terrifying, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like the video, and share it so you won't miss the next turning point of this story. And where are you watching from? A crowded city? A small room late at night? Or a quiet corner where Claire and Nathan's story makes you feel as if you're standing in that freezing hallway with them? Leave a comment with where you're listening from, so I'll know which hearts and which places this story has reached. Thank you for staying through this tense moment. Stay with us because that door doesn't just open into Claire's apartment, it opens into a world she never meant to enter. She tried to walk, but every step felt like a blow to her chest, as though her body were waiting for the slightest imbalance to surrender to the coming nausea. Nathan tightened his grip on her, his broad, calloused hand holding her shoulder with a steadiness that felt practiced, as if he were used to carrying others through storms. But to Claire, the touch was unfamiliar after months of clinical hands and pitying glances. This was the first time someone touched her simply to keep her from falling. The wind from the Charles River sliced through her thin layers like a blade. Claire silently thanked herself for having just enough strength to come out and paint today, and just enough clarity to still be breathing. They moved slowly along the sidewalk, weaving through hurried crowds who didn't spare a second look at two lost figures trying to stay upright. Claire leaned into Nathan, and though she didn't want to admit it, there was something about him that felt strangely safe. Not because he was gentle, he wasn't, but because he looked like the kind of man who could stand in the center of a collapsing world without flinching. They made it halfway down the block before Claire faltered again. Another wave of dizziness hit. She clutched Nathan, and this time he nearly lifted her with one arm. "We need to get inside," he murmured, voice thick and hoarse. "Are you sure you're okay?" Claire nodded, but Nathan didn't believe her. He paused beneath the awning of a closed shop, set the paintings down, and adjusted his hold on her shoulder. Claire saw the dark stain spreading across his coat. Blood. She froze. "You're hurt." Nathan glanced at the tear, then at her, his expression tightening but never wavering. "It's fine. It's shallow. A cut." Who did that to you?" "Long story," he said. "But I'm not here to bring trouble to your door. I'm just avoiding certain people." Claire nodded faintly. She didn't have the strength to panic. Or maybe some part of her recognized that this man was fighting something deeper than a physical wound. "You need a doctor." "I can't go to a hospital," Nathan said, shaking his head. "They'll find me." "Who will?" "Not the police." "Worse," he answered shortly. Then he bent to gather the paintings again. "You need to get inside. If I stay out here longer, I'll drag you into my mess. Trust me, you don't want that." Claire exhaled. "If I don't go in, I'll faint for real. If you leave, you'll bleed out. We're more alike than you think." Nathan stopped, studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Fine. But only for a moment." They continued walking. Claire guided him with a slight tilt of her head toward the side street. Gianna's Bakery. 3 more doors. Nathan scanned the area. When they passed a group of men in dark suits chatting near a corner, he immediately changed direction, slipping through a narrow alley and circling back from behind. Claire wasn't foolish. She noticed how he watched every silhouette, how his right hand always hovered near his chest where she suspected something dangerous was hidden. She also saw the caution, the reflex of someone used to living on the thin line between life and death. "Do you always sell your paintings there?" Nathan asked, his voice softening. Claire nodded. "A few times a week, when I have the strength." "Your paintings. They're beautiful," he said, as though compliments were foreign to him. "Thank you. You sign in the right corner," he noted. "Claire Bennett." "Your hand is steady." She turned to him. "You looked at my paintings?" "I look at everything, but your paintings were the only thing worth looking at on that corner." Claire let out a quiet laugh, a fragile but genuine sound, maybe the first she had made in weeks. Nathan said nothing more. They walked in a silence filled only with wind and footsteps and their heavy breathing. And then the small bakery, Gianna's, appeared ahead of them, its fogged windows and lingering scent of old flour drifting in the winter air. Claire pointed to a narrow staircase along the side. "Second floor." Nathan steadied her up each step, his back tensed with pain, but he didn't complain. When they reached the door of her small apartment, Claire stiffened. Her hand fumbled for her keys and then froze as she realized the door was already ajar. I'm sure I locked it." Nathan immediately pushed her behind him, pulling from beneath his coat a black pistol, the motion smooth and practiced, as if he had done it 100 times. Claire went rigid, ice sliding down her spine. Nathan didn't look back. "Stay put. There might be no one inside. But I need to be sure." And in that instant, Claire understood the man standing before her. The man who had saved her twice in one afternoon was no ordinary stranger. And she, Claire Bennett, was no longer standing outside his world. She had stepped into it. The door swung on its hinges as if someone had shoved it hard just moments earlier, leaving a dark gap gaping like the mouth of a pit. Nathan stepped in first, gun raised, his right shoulder lifting into a guarded stance. Claire stood behind him, her hand gripping the cold doorframe, her heart pounding against her ribs. She had never seen a gun outside of movies, never imagined that her tiny apartment above Gianna's bakery, the only place she still called home, could ever become dangerous. Nathan moved like a shadow, each step controlled, his eyes sweeping across every corner, every pocket of darkness. Claire heard the faint creak of floorboards under his weight, then silence. A moment later, he turned back and nodded. "No one's here anymore." She stepped inside. The air was colder than it should have been. A draft hissed through the cracked open kitchen window. Claire looked around and saw everything. Her paintings were torn, ripped into shreds like discarded paper. The easel was tipped over, the wooden frame snapped. An oil canvas she had finished just the week before, a lavender field under the evening sun, lay face down. The still wet paint smeared like a bleeding wound. The armchair where she usually sat to paint was flipped upside down. Blankets dragged off the sofa, drawers pulled open, clothes thrown everywhere. The whole room looked as though it had been struck by a blind, furious storm. Claire sank to her knees, her trembling fingers brushing against a shattered frame, glass pieces catching the last traces of daylight. Amid the wreckage, she recognized an old photograph, the picture of her mother when she was young, lying in a nest of broken glass, the surface scratched by a long, jagged line. Claire swallowed hard, her lips quivering without sound. Nathan stood behind her, the gun now lowered, but his expression pulled tight like a wire. "They were looking for something," he murmured. "Or someone. Could be me. Could be they thought you were connected." Claire lifted her gaze, eyes blurred with tears. "Why me? I don't have anything worth destroying." Nathan scanned the room, his eyes landing on a lone painting still hanging on the wall, swaying slightly in the wind. "You were the last person seen with me out there. If they followed me, they saw me help you. That makes you a vulnerability, a message. They know I care." Claire let out a short, hollow laugh, a sound misplaced in the wreckage of her home. "I'm just a girl selling art on the street. I'm not anyone's weakness." Nathan lowered himself beside her, his blood-stained hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "You're wrong. You're the first person I stopped for, in a very long time." Claire fell silent, her eyes drifting over the shredded canvases. Each one represented a day she had fought to live, to paint, to simply exist. Now they lay scattered on the floor like corpses. "Did they take anything?" Nathan asked. She shook her head. "There's nothing to take, just paintings and medication." He nodded. "Then they didn't come to steal. They came to warn." Claire looked at him, truly looked at him for the first time, the blood soaking through his shoulder, the eyes that never relaxed, the tension carved into every line of his face. "Who are you?" she asked quietly. "And why does someone want you dead?" Nathan exhaled and placed the gun on the floor. "My name is Nathan Russo, and I'm a man being hunted." Claire wanted to ask more, to understand everything, but instead she whispered, "I'm so tired." Nathan nodded. He rose and gently lifted her to her feet. "You should sit down. I'll put things back as much as I can for now. It's not safe, but at least you'll be able to breathe." Claire leaned her head against his shoulder, her steps unsteady. Amid the wreckage of her life strewn across the floor, Nathan guided her forward, as though he were trying to piece together the broken parts of himself at the same time. Claire sat on the floor with her back against the wall, her arms wrapped around the torn canvas, her knees pulled up to her chest, as if that was the only way to keep herself from dissolving into pieces like everything else scattered around the room. Before her lay the sunflower painting she had created during the final week of her second round of chemotherapy, one of the rare days she still had enough strength to sit at the easel for hours. She had used the brightest yellow she owned for the petals, blended a touch of orange into the center to make it burn with the same hunger for life she carried inside. Now a muddy footprint crushed the painted sun at its core. The petals were torn clean in half, the canvas ripped at the edges as though someone had stabbed it intentionally. Claire brushed her fingers lightly across the fabric, her trembling hand tracing the rough crack in the dried paint. She didn't cry. Her tears had fallen for too many things, but not for this. This wasn't just a painting. It was the only part of her that illness had not taken. And now someone had replaced it with a threat. Nathan stepped closer quietly. He didn't speak at first. Under the dim slant of the crooked desk lamp, shadows carved deep lines across his face. Claire didn't look up. She spoke in a low, drifting voice, as though talking to the version of herself who had painted that canvas. "I painted this when my hair started to fall out. I sat there, in the middle of the night, spreading color with my hands because I couldn't hold a brush. And now look. She lifted the broken frame. They crushed it, as if it meant nothing. Nathan didn't answer right away. He studied the painting, then lowered himself to the floor beside her. "I'm sorry," he said. "Not because I stepped on it, but because I brought this trouble here." Claire turned to him, meeting his eyes fully for the first time since he had set the gun down. "I asked you before," she said. "Now I want the real answer." "I used to work for a Mafia family in New York. The Russo family. My family. There was no getting out once I was pulled in as a teenager. I grew up in a world where guns were the only language anyone listened to, and loyalty was something you could buy or sell, depending on who offered the better promise." Claire remained silent. Not because she was shocked, but because something about him had always carried the weight of a man who'd lived his whole life on a battlefield. Nathan went on. "I worked for Dominic Russo, my uncle, the head of the family. I was his right hand, until someone else wanted that position, Tony, Dominic's grandson. He set up an ambush. I was hurt, but I survived. Now I'm a traitor in their eyes, a stray piece on the board, and anyone connected to me becomes bait." Claire shut her eyes briefly. Not because she didn't understand, but because she needed a moment to swallow everything he had just said. "So," she whispered, "I'm the bait, the sign that you're slipping." "They don't think I'm weaker," Nathan answered. "They think I have a weakness, and you're the first person in years who made them believe that." Claire set the painting gently on the floor. "I don't know if I should feel touched," she said softly, "or throw you out." Nathan looked at her. He didn't plead. He didn't defend himself. He simply met her eyes with a steady honesty that never wavered. "If you tell me to leave, I'll go, but you still won't be safe. Not after they saw me with you. They'll think you know something, or will say something." Claire leaned her head back against the wall, staring at the ceiling as though it might have answers she didn't. "I have nothing but a few paintings and some bottles of medication. If they think I'm a threat, then this world truly has lost its mind. The world I come from," Nathan said quietly, "has never been sane." Claire drew a deep breath, sharp enough to ache in her chest. "Stay. Not because I need protection, but because I don't want to die alone in this room. And if you leave, maybe I won't have anyone to talk to again." Nathan nodded. For the first time since they met, something lighter flickered across his face, a small shift that felt almost like humanity breaking through the armor. "Then I'll stay." She closed her eyes, whispering like a breath against the cold air. "But next time, don't let anyone step on my flowers." And for the first time, Nathan smiled. Not perfectly, but honestly. And in the middle of the wreckage, that was enough. Night had fully settled by the time Claire fumbled around her tiny kitchen, lighting the old gas stove to boil water. The apartment still smelled of paint, dust, and dried blood, but the blue flame rising from the burner stirred something familiar inside her. Nathan stood by the window with his back against the wooden frame, his gaze locked on the alley below. He had been there for nearly half an hour, unmoving like a statue. Claire set the kettle over the flame and reached for 2 chipped ceramic mugs from the cupboard. One had a sun painted on it, cracked along the handle. The other had once been white but was now stained with age. She poured a pinch of chamomile into each mug and spoke without turning around. "Are you planning to stand there all night?" Nathan didn't answer at once. After a moment, he nodded, his eyes still fixed on the window. "I'm used to it." Claire watched him quietly, noticing the broad line of his shoulders beneath the coat he had taken off, the shirt beneath still stiff with dried blood. "You could sit down for a while. They won't come back tonight." Nathan finally pulled away from the window and walked slowly to the kitchen table. When he sat down, she nudged a mug toward him. "Chamomile tea. It's not whiskey, but it's good enough to forget for a moment that someone out there wants both of us dead." He lifted the mug, sniffed it, then took a small sip. "I can't remember the last time I drank tea." Claire leaned against the counter, cupping her own mug between her palms for warmth. "I used to hate chamomile, but after chemo, everything else made me nauseous. At least it doesn't make me sick." Nathan looked up at her, truly noticing her for the first time. "How long have you had cancer?" 14 months, Claire answered, her voice soft as mist. "Breast cancer, lymph node metastasis. The doctor said if I kept up with treatment, I still had a chance. But I missed my last 2 sessions. Money, no insurance. They said they'll stop treating me if I miss one more." Nathan tightened his grip on the mug. "What about your family?" My mother died of the same illness. My father left when I was in elementary school. No siblings, no one. She shrugged. The paintings are all I have left. I paint when I have enough strength. I sell them when I have enough energy to stand on the street. Every painting sold means another day I get to stay alive. Silence settled over the small kitchen. Nathan set his mug down. I've never been afraid of dying, he said slowly. I grew up in a world where death was a tool. I learned how to use a gun before I learned how to drive. I thought I had nothing left to lose. He stared at his palms, the old scars etched deeply into his skin. Then I saw you collapse on the sidewalk, and I ran toward you instead of walking away. Claire stared at him, unblinking. Why? Nathan lifted his head, his eyes shadowed. My sister. She died of cancer too. When I was 19, she used to paint. Your work. It reminded me of the pieces she hung all over her room. Claire tightened her grip on the warm mug, her lips trembling not from the cold. I can't decide whether I should thank you or resent you for dragging me into your world. Nathan nodded gently. Both are fair. She set her mug down and stepped closer to him. If you're staying, we need rules. I can't take more chaos. I can't live every night wondering if a gun will go off. I already have cancer for that. Nathan watched her without resistance. I'm listening. No killing in this apartment, Claire said. No bringing people here. No lying to me. And if I'm painting, you stay quiet. A flicker of surprise crossed Nathan's face. Then he smiled, almost a respectful bow in the form of an expression. All right, I accept that. You have the rules. I'll take the responsibility. Claire exhaled, some invisible weight shifting off her chest. I have a sofa. It's not soft, but it's clean. Nathan looked toward the old couch near the window and nodded. I've slept in far worse places. Claire turned back to the stove and poured more hot water into her mug. We're like two strays. One forgotten by the world, one hunted by it. Nathan picked up his mug again, his voice quieter than before. But maybe, just this once, two strays can find a place to stop together. Claire didn't reply. She only sipped her tea, letting the chamomile warmth soften the sharp corners of her life. And for the first time in many nights, she didn't feel alone. Morning light filtered through the window, painting pale gold streaks across the dark wooden floor and the torn canvases still lying in the corner. Claire sat in her worn painting chair, a loose wool scarf around her neck, her brush grazing the canvas as if each stroke were a breath she needed to take. The air carried the mingled scent of paint and chamomile tea. Nathan sat at the table behind her, his eyes fixed on her back from the moment she began mixing colors. He was no longer wearing the blood-stained shirt, but an old t-shirt Claire had given him, slightly too big and marked with a faint purple blotch on the shoulder. She lifted her brush, paused, then turned her head, her voice soft but firm. You've been staring at me like that for a while. Want to try? Nathan frowned. Try what? Painting. Claire nodded toward the neatly arranged canvas and paints on the side table. I set it up this morning. Don't worry. No one becomes an artist overnight. But you have hands, you have eyes, and you have time. So start. Nathan looked at the brushes, then at Claire, as if she had just asked him to defuse a bomb. I've never... Good, Claire cut in. That means you have no bad habits to unlearn. She turned back to her own piece. Nathan stood, slowly taking the seat in front of a blank canvas. He picked up a brush awkwardly, as if handling an unfamiliar weapon. What do I paint? He asked. Claire smiled. Anything you see. It doesn't have to be right. It just has to feel. Nathan stared at the canvas. For a moment, his eyes dimmed with something heavy. The same hand that had long grown used to tightening around a trigger trembled slightly as he touched the brush to paint. He dipped it into deep blue, dragging a hesitant line across the surface. Then another. Claire said nothing. She left him alone with that unfamiliar territory, the same way she had once learned to paint her way out of sterile hospital rooms and the silence between treatments. 10 minutes passed before Nathan stopped. On the canvas was an abstract cluster of colors, no clear shape, only overlapping bands of dark blue, gray, and bruised red. Claire walked over and stood behind him. Do you see it? She asked. See what? That's what's inside you. The color of the memories you haven't spoken, the wounds you haven't healed. Nathan remained silent for a long time. Then he whispered, as though confessing to something buried for years. I used to dream of blood so often I couldn't tell what was real anymore. But painting this, I feel calmer. Just a little. But it's real. Claire sat beside him. Because painting isn't about forgetting. It's about facing it, turning it into something else. Not prettier, but truer. Nathan looked at the piece he'd made, not criticizing it, not asking for her approval. He simply nodded. I get it now. They stayed there, each at their own canvas, sometimes without speaking, letting the soft sound of bristles against fabric and the faint simmer of tea in the kitchen fill the quiet. Two lost souls tracing their way toward a nameless resting place. On Claire's canvas, the shape of a man standing in a field of sunflowers began to emerge, his back turned to the viewer, his shoulders slightly hunched as if carrying something unbearably heavy. But among the flowers, a small light glowed in the far corner. And on Nathan's painting, the colors had softened, streaks of yellow beginning to slip into the gray. Not a shape yet, but enough to see that something in him had begun to change. Late afternoon light streamed through the window, casting warm, elongated shadows across the wooden floor and the two unfinished canvases. Claire set her brush down, her hands stained with pale violet paint, and glanced over at Nathan, who sat bowed over his work, concentrating so intently he didn't hear the kettle whistling in the kitchen. On his canvas, a once empty expanse of white was beginning to fill with clusters of small yellow dots. At first they were faint, blurred washes, but gradually they grew brighter, more deliberate, small and steady like breaths. Claire walked toward him, moving gently as if afraid she might break something fragile in this moment. Nathan didn't look up. She stood behind him, watching each stroke as though he were learning to write in a new language, one without words, without violence, shaped only by the simple act of breathing and touching color. "What flowers are those?" she asked softly, her fingers resting lightly on the back of his chair. Nathan turned slightly, though his eyes never left the canvas. "I don't know their name. I just remember a field behind my house when I was a kid, full of tiny yellow wildflowers. Every time the wind blew, they leaned one way, then another, like waves." Claire smiled. "They might be wild daisies. They grow where no one plants them. They exist on their own terms." Nathan set the brush down and leaned back, studying the canvas he had completed only a third of the way. The yellow dots drifted like bits of sunlight, shapeless yet alive. "It's the first time I've painted something that isn't blood or shadows," he murmured. "Just dots of color. But I feel like they're breathing." Claire sat on the floor facing him, her gaze warm. "They're yours. No one else can touch what they mean." Nathan looked down at his hands, paint smeared between his fingers like stains, except this time the color was yellow, not red. He let out a faint, almost disbelieving laugh. "These hands have killed people. Now I'm using them to paint flowers. No one is born perfect, Nathan. But if you still have the chance to create something beautiful, then life is still worth living." Claire picked up a sheet of white paper, folded it in half, dipped one corner into the yellow paint he had been using, then pressed it lightly onto the page. When she opened it, two mirrored dots appeared, like butterfly wings. "See? Every mark can become something balanced." Nathan nodded, his eyes quieter now, softened by something he thought he had lost. "Do you think someone like me can change?" Claire didn't answer right away. She looked at his painting, then into his eyes. "I'm not certain, but I see a man who's trying, and trying is where all change begins." A breeze stirred the curtain, and in that fragile stillness even the city noises outside seemed to soften, as if the world itself had slowed to give space to two people sitting in a small room, surrounded by paint and memory, caught between what had been broken and what was beginning to grow. Nathan reached for his brush again, dipping it into a pale green. "I think these yellow dots need a few stems, something to hold on to." Claire smiled, saying nothing. She returned to her own canvas, though her eyes lingered on the curve of his back, on the way he leaned in as if creating a world he'd never believed he was allowed to enter. And as the last sliver of sunlight slipped across the floorboards, Nathan's painting gained 3 new yellow dots and a few thin, tender strokes of green. No one could say what kind of flowers they were, but both of them felt it. They were growing, truly growing. That morning, Boston welcomed a light rain. Droplets clung to the window frame, sliding down slowly like nameless tears. Claire woke first, as she usually did, brewed a pot of chamomile tea, then sat in the wooden chair near her easel, looking out at the street. She didn't paint, and she didn't read. She simply sat there with her hands wrapped tightly around the faded wool scarf at her neck, sipping warmth as though it were the last piece of life she could hold on to before it dissolved into the mist outside. Nathan woke a few minutes later, his footsteps low and steady on the wooden floor. He wore the t-shirt Claire had given him the day before, its sleeves rolled up to his elbows, faint bruises still marking his arm from the last time he had run for his life. He walked to her, standing behind her for a long moment before speaking softly. "Why aren't you painting today?" Claire didn't turn. "Because today I just want to remember." "Remember what?" "What it feels like to be alive without being afraid of tomorrow." Nathan sat down on the floor beside her, his back resting against the leg of her chair. "I used to think living only meant outlasting other people, but now I see that surviving without anything worth protecting is just stretching out a sentence." Claire looked down at the top of his head, her fingers brushing lightly against his shoulder like a wordless nod. "Did you ever have something worth protecting?" Nathan nodded slowly. "My sister, Lucia. But she's gone. And I kept living. Every year, I traded other people's lives to hold on to my own. When I finally realized I had no one left, I didn't even know what living meant anymore." Claire set her teacup on the table, then knelt down to sit beside him. They sat together in the small apartment, surrounded by the sound of rain and the lingering scent of yesterday's paint. "Living isn't about waiting for something grand," she said. "Sometimes it's just a morning like this, a cup of tea, a person beside you who doesn't make you brace yourself." Nathan turned to look at her, his eyes slowing, softening. "I used to think I didn't have a place in anyone's life. But here in this apartment, with you, I feel different." Claire smiled gently and leaned her forehead against his shoulder. "Because you're starting to choose instead of run." Nathan was quiet for a long time. Then he reached into his pocket and took out an old silver necklace, the pendant containing a tiny dried wild daisy pressed under clear resin. "Lucia made this for me. I never wore it, because I didn't think I deserved to. But now, I think she wouldn't mind if I gave it to the person who helped me paint my first flower again." Claire held the pendant in her palm, her eyes shining. "I'll keep it. But not because I helped you, because it belongs to a man who's learning how to live with purpose." Nathan looked at her deeply, as though every unspoken thing between them had settled silently into his gaze. "If someone asked me, after all these years of killing, whether I ever thought about forgiveness, I'd say no. Until I met you." Claire nodded softly. "I'm not a priest. I'm not a doctor. I'm just someone trying to live every day I have left. But if I've helped you even a little, then maybe it means I haven't lost my reason entirely." Nathan took her hand this time, not to hold her up or to pull her from danger, but simply to hold it. "I want to protect you, not because you're fragile, but because you're the first person who's made me want to stand still and look at the world without firing a single shot." Claire didn't answer. She rested her head on his shoulder, listening to the rain tapping softly against the window like the quiet heartbeat of the city still pulsing out there. Between them, there was no distance left, no fear, only two people, one fractured past and one fragile present, choosing to stay not because they had to, but because for the first time, they had something worth keeping. The sound of shattering glass pierced the room before Nathan even realized it wasn't the rain. A bullet ripped through the window, burying itself in the wall behind them, leaving a small crater and a burst of dust drifting in the air. Claire jolted upright, but Nathan was already moving, springing to life like some instinctive creature awakened by danger. He pulled her to the floor, shielding her with his body just as the next round tore past, missing their heads by inches. He didn't need to look to know exactly what was happening. They had been found. Claire trembled violently, her eyes wide, her whole body frozen beneath his. Nathan leaned close, his voice low, edged with the kind of command carved into him by blood. "You need to get downstairs. When I say run, you run. Don't look back. Understand?" Claire shook her head, her lips parting without sound. Another bullet blasted through the window frame. Nathan shifted, grabbing the pistol hidden behind the chair with a motion so quick it blurred. He crawled across the floor to the wall beside the window and peered through the jagged gap where glass had blown out. 4 men, 2 on the rooftop across the street, 1 on the balcony to the right, and 1 climbing the side stairwell. They weren't here to warn him. They were here to end it. Nathan turned back, dragging Claire toward the bedroom door. "Is there a way out to the roof from your window?" She nodded, her voice tight with fear. "Yes, through the gutter pipe, then across to the next building." "Good. Listen to me. When I fire, you go. No hesitation." Claire gripped his hand tightly. "What about you?" "I'll be behind you. I'll hold them off." Another bullet punched through the front door, splintering wood into dust. Nathan clenched his jaw, scanning the room. He dragged a wooden table against the door, then pushed Claire into the dark bedroom. The space was small, dim, lit only by the narrow window opening onto the roof. She unlatched it, cold wind rushing inside. The gunfire paused. They were repositioning. Nathan stood at the door, gun ready. A second later, the front door was kicked open and one man burst in, weapon raised. Nathan fired. The gunshot cracked through the apartment, the bullet slamming into the attacker's shoulder, sending him crashing backward into a fallen chair. Before the second man could react, Nathan fired twice more. One shot missed. The other tore into the side of the table and struck the man in the abdomen. "Claire, go!" he shouted. She climbed onto the sill, gripping the metal gutter with shaking hands, hauling herself outside. The tin roof was slick with rain, but she didn't stop. Behind her, Nathan backed toward the window, still firing. Another gunman leapt from the balcony, bullets spraying wild arcs. Nathan ducked low, returned fire, and the shot punched through the man's chest, dropping him instantly. Footsteps thundered up the stairwell. Nathan rushed into the bedroom, grabbing Claire's hand just as she reached the rooftop of the next building. He climbed after her, narrowly missing the last bullet that blasted through the shattered window and slammed into the wall where his head had been a heartbeat earlier. They crawled along the rooftop, the cold wind whipping their faces, the bitter tang of gunpowder still sharp in the air. Claire panted, her palms slick with blood from scraping against the metal, but she didn't stop. Nathan guided her over a narrow gap. Then they both dropped down onto the third-floor balcony of the adjacent building. There was no time to think, only breath, heartbeat, and darkness swallowing the streets below. They ran through the hallway and down the back fire escape. When the door at ground level swung open, Nathan swept the alley with his eyes. No pursuers. They had been held off for now. He took Claire's hand and pulled her with him through the back alley behind Gianna's bakery, weaving through narrow streets slick with rain. The drizzle thickened into heavy drops, cold and sharp against the pavement. They finally collapsed beside an old delivery truck, both sinking to the ground, their backs against the stained brick wall. Claire gasped for breath, gripping Nathan's arm, her heart pounding as though trying to tear free. "They know where I live," she whispered. "There's no going back." Nathan nodded, eyes fixed on the end of the alley. "I know. We leave. Tonight." Claire turned to him, fear replaced by something deeper, heavier. "They won't stop, will they?" Nathan met her gaze directly. "No, not until one side is gone." Claire squeezed his hand. "Then let's go. Anywhere, as long as you're alive. And I can still paint." The wind swept through the alley, carrying the scent of blood, metal, and rain. In the darkness, they didn't need promises. They only needed to keep moving, because there was nothing left to lose. But one truth was becoming clearer than ever. They had each other, and for tonight, that was enough to survive. Vermont greeted them with a brooding sky and endless rows of bare trees stretching along both sides of the road. The old car borrowed from someone Nathan once knew groaned its way through each curve, the tires sliding slightly over the thin layer of snow coating the asphalt. Claire sat in the passenger seat, her head leaning against the window, eyes half closed, lips pale from the cold and exhaustion. Nathan said nothing, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white. His eyes never left the road. Yet every so often he glanced at her, and each time, something inside him clenched. After more than 6 hours of driving without rest, they reached a small wooden cabin tucked deep within a forest of pines. The house was worn, its roof lined with moss, and the porch groaned under Nathan's weight as he carried Claire from the car. She had drifted in and out of sleep during the ride, feverish, her temples damp with cold sweat. He laid her gently on the old sofa by the fireplace, hurried to start a fire, then covered her with a blanket. A moment later, Claire opened her eyes, her voice barely a whisper. "Where are we?" "A house belonging to someone I once helped in Burlington," Nathan answered softly, his hand never leaving her forehead. "He's been overseas for years. Left me the key, said I could come if I ever needed it." Claire nodded faintly, then drifted off again. Hours later, when she woke once more, her face had grown paler, her lips dry and cracked, her eyes sunken. Nathan brought her a cup of warm water, but she managed only a few sips before shaking her head. "Nathan," she breathed, her voice thin as thread. I missed my treatment." He sat beside her, taking her hand warm but trembling. "We'll find a way. You'll be all right." Claire smiled, but it was a broken, hopeless smile. "No, you don't understand. The last infusion was my final chance to keep my white blood cell count under control. It's too late now to go back to the old protocol. I tried. I really tried. Her voice broke, tears sliding silently down her hollow cheeks. I'm not afraid of dying, Nathan. I'm afraid everything ends before I finish something. Before I finish all the paintings waiting inside me. Before I can say I truly lived. Nathan said nothing. He lowered his forehead to her hand, his other hand gripping her wrist, as if he could hold on to every last beat beneath her skin. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice rough and strangled. All of this. You being pulled into my world, torn from your own life. That's my fault. Claire shook her head weakly. No, I don't regret it, because I saw your first flower. I saw a man trying to love, to trust, to repaint himself. If this is the end, then at least I had something real. Snow began falling outside the window, whitening the forest beyond the cabin. Nathan stood, walked to the fireplace, and added more logs, his eyes burning. He opened an old cabinet and found a wool blanket, then returned to drape it over Claire's legs. Her eyes were closed again, her breath thin but steady, her fingers still clutching the hem of his shirt as if unwilling to let go. In that fragile moment, Nathan understood that everything he had ever done, every ruthless act he had committed to survive, meant nothing if he couldn't keep her alive. Not because she was fragile, but because she was the first thing in his life that made him want to become something better. And now he was losing her second by second, minute by minute, right there in his arms. He sat down, staring into the fire, silently swearing he would not let her die in this cabin. Not while he still had breath, not while he could still do something, anything, even if it meant going back into hell. Morning broke after a heavy, unrelenting night, the snow still falling but finer now, drifting softly like words never spoken. Claire lay motionless on the sofa, her face drained of color, her breath so thin that each time Nathan bent close to listen, he feared he was already too late. Her hand was ice cold, despite the 3 blankets he had wrapped around her. Nathan had not slept at all. His eyes were sunken with worry, his mind spinning in a single desperate loop. He had to get her to a hospital. But with what money? They had nothing. No insurance, no fixed address, no valid papers. He had once had money more than enough, but all of it was tainted. His accounts had been frozen the moment he fled New York. All that remained were a few $100s in his pocket and an old phone without a SIM card. Nathan rose, pacing the small cabin like a trapped animal caught inside a cage made of helplessness. At last he stopped at the old table and pulled out a worn leather wallet. Inside was a thin metal card with no name, only a tiny owl etched into the corner. He stared at it for a long moment, as if it were the final door he had never dared to open. Claire had once told him she feared dying because she had not lived fully. He, on the other hand, had spent his entire life battling to survive, only to find himself powerless now, while the only person he wanted to hold on to was slipping away. He tucked the card into his pocket, shrugged on his jacket, and walked to her side. "Claire," he whispered, bending down, his hand brushing her cheek. "Can you hear me?" She opened her eyes slowly, a faint, fragile smile touching her lips. "You're still here?" "Always," he murmured. "I'm taking you to a doctor. We'll redo the tests. There might still be a way." Claire shook her head, her voice barely a breeze. "Nathan, don't go back there. I don't want you risking yourself." He lowered his forehead to hers, eyes closed tight as though trying to hold on to the last warmth inside her refusal. "I've lived for meaningless things," he said. "Now I have a reason, and I won't sit here and watch it disappear." She didn't speak again. Nathan pressed her hand in his, then rose, his gaze forged into steel. He drove for 3 straight hours to the hospital in Montpelier, bringing her in under a false name, lying about everything except the truth that she needed emergency care. When the doctors saw her numbers, they admitted her immediately. While she was taken for tests, Nathan sat alone in the stark white hallway, his heart beating like a drum trapped inside his ribs. He had never prayed in his life, but in that moment he whispered like a man who had never believed in anything, and suddenly found himself with only one fragile hope. A young doctor emerged, his expression grave. "We'll do everything we can," he said. "But she needs to switch to a new protocol, stronger, more expensive, and it has to begin within the next 2 days. Are you her family?" Nathan nodded. "How much?" "At least 30,000 for the initial phase." Nathan nodded again, without hesitation. "I'll take care of it." That night, He sat in the car with the cabin light on, placing the metal card on his knee. He flipped it over, revealing a row of faintly engraved numbers beneath. An old contact. A man whose life Nathan had once saved during an operation that should have killed them both. Nathan lifted the phone, inserted the SIM, and dialed the number. A man's voice answered after 2 rings, low and wary. "Who is this?" Nathan drew a deep breath. "It's Russo. I need an advance. I'm not buying weapons. I'm buying time for a woman who is dying." Silence stretched out, deep and dark as a pit. Then the voice chuckled quietly. "I owe you my life, Nathan, and debts must be paid. You'll have the money by morning, but after that, you'll be a target from both sides." Nathan stared through the windshield at the falling snow. "I know, but if she can live one more day, I'll take whatever comes." And the next morning, he signed the hospital admission papers with a false name, his hand still marked with dried blood along the wrist. Claire would get her treatment. This time, at any cost, he would fight. Not for himself, but for the first person who ever made him want to stay in this world. Claire lay on the hospital bed, her eyes barely open beneath the pale wash of light drifting through the window. The IV lines attached to her arm trembled softly with each breath she drew, her skin still ghostly but no longer as colorless as the day before. Nathan sat beside her, her hand resting inside his, small and cool and heartbreakingly fragile. It had been more than 6 hours since the first round of the new treatment had begun, and she still hadn't spoken much, only faint nods, or the softest of smiles when he asked if she was comfortable. Nathan had never feared silence the way he feared it now, because silence forced him to hear his own voice inside his head, a voice he had spent his entire life avoiding. At last he spoke, his tone rough and unsteady. "Claire, if you still have the strength to listen, there's something you need to know." He drew in a long breath, his gaze fixed on her fingers curled loosely between his, as if looking into her eyes would drain the courage he'd scraped together. "I was born in Brooklyn, in a neighborhood where violence was the first language every child learned. My father beat my mother to death when I was 8. A week later, he was shot behind a bar's parking lot, and I was thrown into the foster system where the only law was the one you could enforce with your fists." He paused, the words clawing their way up from a place he'd buried for decades. "When I was 16, I killed a man for the first time, a drunk who laid his hands on Lucia, my sister. He fell on the first swing of the knife. No one asked questions. No one looked for him. No one cared. And from there, everything just kept going, like it was the only path left for me." Nathan stood and walked to the window, watching the light rain slide across the hospital roof, his voice dropping to a low, weary rumble. "By 23, I was working for Dominic, running messages, collecting payments, handling problems. I did the things other men refused to do. No emotion, no conscience, just assignments. Until Lucia died of cancer. She was the last thing that made me feel human. And when I lost her, I buried whatever part of me still knew how to love." He turned back toward Claire. "Then I met you. In a moment that should have meant nothing on a gray street in a city that never stops moving, you fell. Your paintings scattered like broken sunlight, and I ran to you. Not because I needed to, not because I calculated anything. I just ran. And I realized, maybe something inside me wasn't completely dead." Claire opened her eyes fully, her gaze soft as a lake after rain. "I know," she whispered. "I knew you were never heartless. If you were, you wouldn't have stopped that day." Nathan sat beside her again, taking her hand, this time with a firmer, steadier grip, as though anchoring a vow he had never dared to make. "I don't know if I can ever escape what I've done," he said. "I don't know if anyone could forgive that past, but I know one thing. I don't want to live that way anymore. Not out of fear, not because I'm running, but because I finally found something worth protecting. And that something is you." Claire smiled, faint but radiant, and her eyes shone brighter than they ever had. "Then live as the man I see when I look at you. Not the killer, but the man who learned to repaint his life with wildflowers." Outside, the rain kept falling, but inside that small hospital room, something had shifted. Not the illness, not the ending, but the beginning. A beginning no longer shaped by death, but by a first, trembling step toward the light. Nathan tightened his hold on her hand, this time not out of pain, but out of love. And he whispered, "I'm not a killer anymore. You made me choose something else. You are that something else, Boston lay drowned beneath a thick fog when Nathan slipped quietly into a small cafe on the corner of the South End. His knit cap was pulled low across his brow, the dark coat swallowing his broad frame, but his eyes, sharp as a blade hidden beneath heavy lashes, missed nothing. In the inner pocket of his coat rested something he had spent years trying not to think about. A small black USB drive held together with aging tape, the handwritten words on it fading but still legible, "In case of betrayal." Dominic had once ordered it destroyed the moment a deal was done, but Nathan had kept a copy, driven by the last instinct of a man who always knew the end would eventually come for him. He took a seat in the farthest corner, ordered a black coffee with no sugar, and placed an old second-hand laptop on the table, one bought from a shop that never asked for names. He slid the USB into the port and drew a long, steady breath. The screen flickered for several seconds before directories bloomed across it like ghosts rising from the dark. Surveillance footage, recorded calls, shadow contracts, details of offshore transfers funneled through a shell corporation in Panama, photographs of well-known political figures at private gatherings with Dominic and Tony, and promises made in low voices, dropped charges traded for influence, silence bought with power. Nathan opened each file with the same cold, unblinking gaze. Familiar voices echoed through the tinny speakers. Dominic, Tony, and others who once called him brother, now revealed clearly for what they were, predators stripped of their masks. He copied every file into a new folder and named it Lucia. It was the first time he had spoken that name in years, a vow without ceremony, a promise that no one else would die the way his little sister did. An hour later, he walked out of the cafe, leaving behind the laptop and the original USB beside a handwritten note. "This is enough to drag an entire network to the bottom. Don't worry about who sent it. Just have the spine to open it. N." He sent an anonymous email to 3 addresses: an independent investigative journalist, a lawyer whose career Dominic once threatened into silence, and an FBI agent who had nearly died for refusing to look the other way. Within 10 minutes, all 3 emails had been opened. There was no reply, but he didn't need one. The web had already begun to tremble. They would know someone out there was burning their exits to ash. That evening, Nathan returned to the hospital. Claire was asleep, the warm yellow light softening the sharp lines of her thin face. He sat beside her and slipped a small photograph from his pocket. Lucia at 15, smiling wide atop her battered bicycle. He placed the photo on the bedside table next to the painting Claire had recently made for him, a portrait of a man standing in a field, surrounded by small yellow wildflowers bright as sunlight. Nathan spoke in a whisper, barely louder than breath, afraid to disturb her sleep. "Claire, it's done. There's no going back. No more shadows, no more half-light. Everything he had hoarded, locked, buried for years, had exploded into the world, undeniable and unretractable. No one could bribe their way out of the truth he had unleashed. And if Dominic or Tony came looking for him, he wouldn't run. Not this time. He would stay here, with her, to prove one thing and one thing only, that even a man who once took lives could stand his ground, not to save himself, but to protect the one thing left in his heart that had never been corrupted. And that was her. Early morning in Vermont lay under a thin veil of mist that clung to the hospital roof, the bare trees trembling in the first cold winds of the season. Nathan stood silently by the window in Claire's room, hands buried deep in his coat pockets, eyes following the slow movements outside, where a few nurses pushed patients along the garden paths. Claire was still asleep, breathing steadily, her face softer than it had been in days, peaceful in a way he had almost forgotten she could be. In just a few hours, he would have to leave, not to flee as he once did, but to end everything. The remaining names, the men who once sat beside Dominic, who signed orders to erase anyone daring to defy the organization, they were already disappearing into shadows as news of the data leak spread across the media and their internal network. But Nathan knew that unless he stepped forward himself, unless he finished this with his own hands, the storm would never close. Claire would never be safe. He returned to her bedside, bent down, and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. Claire stirred, her eyes opening slowly. "You didn't sleep?" she asked, her voice still rough. "No," Nathan murmured. "I have to go." She knew. She didn't ask where, didn't need an explanation. Her eyes met his, understanding more of him than anyone ever had. "How long?" 3 days, he said, with quiet certainty. 4, if things get complicated. But I'll come back. And after that? Claire whispered, her thin fingers tightening around his hand. We disappear again? No, Nathan said, his voice solid as stone. This time we're done running. When it's over, I'll take you home. A real home, Claire smiled faintly, tears glimmering at the corners of her eyes. You've never had a place you could call home, have you? Nathan shook his head. Not until I met you. He stood and set a small envelope into her hand. Inside were copies of the documents he'd released, several handwritten notes, and a single emergency phone number. If anything happens, call this number. Agent Lee with the Federal Investigation Team. She knows everything. She'll protect you. No one protects me better than you, Claire said softly, pulling his hand toward her. So, come back. Nathan leaned down, pressing his forehead to hers, breathing in the faint scent of chamomile threading through her hair. I promise, he said, voice low and certain. Whatever happens, I'll come back. Then he turned away, refusing to look back even once because he knew that if he lingered for another second, his heart would refuse to let his feet move. The old gray car rumbled to life in the fog-drenched morning, pulling out of the hospital lot with Nathan behind the wheel, eyes steady, mind fixed on one purpose, to end it. Not for revenge, but for release. No more turning back. No more faces in the dark haunting Claire's sleep. This final journey was his farewell to the past he once survived with a gun in his hand, and it was the doorway back to the only place he had ever dared to call home, the place where she waited for him among wildflowers and canvases still unfinished. Angela lived on the second floor of an old building in Little Italy, New York, a place that had served as a safe house for Dominic's closed-door meetings for nearly 2 decades. Her kitchen always carried the scent of basil and garlic, the window perpetually cracked open, and the radio played classical music from morning until night. She had been the housekeeper for the Dominici family since Dominic's father was alive, and she was the only person ever allowed to enter the old boss's private room without knocking. So when Nathan appeared at her door thinner, his hair longer, but his eyes carrying the same loneliness she had seen the first day she met him, Angela only shook her head softly, neither surprised nor afraid. She opened the door, motioned him inside, and slowly poured 2 cups of tea. They sat in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the ticking of the wall clock and the soft clink of a spoon stirring porcelain. You've come back because of Dominic? She asked at last, not looking at him but watching the faint steam rising from her cup. Nathan nodded. For the last time. Angela nodded in return, offering neither reproach nor warning. She had seen too many men leave and never return, and she had buried her own son after a night caught between loyalty and humanity. They used to say you were a loyal dog, she continued, her gaze lifting to meet his. But I always saw a frightened boy sitting on the kitchen steps, scribbling pictures of a girl named Lucia on a scrap of paper. Nathan tightened his grip around the cup in his hands. I didn't have a choice. I know, Angela said, her voice softening. I saw the way you avoided looking into someone's eyes every time you had to take a life. Saw how you left flowers at the doors of those who had no family left to mourn them. And I remember very clearly the first time Dominic asked you to torture a traitor. You didn't do it. You stood still, silent, frozen. And when Dominic raised his gun to finish the job himself, you dropped to your knees and begged him to spare the man. Do you remember? Nathan nodded faintly, his voice raw. I remember. It was the first time he hit me. Angela rose, rummaged through an old drawer, then returned with a thick envelope, placing it into his hands. Inside were medical records, photographs, and pages filled with Dominic's meticulous handwriting. I kept these all these years. Dominic wrote everything down, things he didn't dare let anyone else see. There's enough in here to prove to the entire world that you were never like him. You were never the monster they whispered about. Nathan opened the envelope, scanning the pages. One note from Dominic read, Russo has a conscience. He saves more than he kills, but conscience feeds no one. One day, it will make him betray me. Nathan let out a soft, bitter laugh. Angela placed her hand on his shoulder, her thin fingers steady and sure. You are a good man, Nathan. You just lived in a world that didn't allow goodness to survive. Nathan looked at her, his eyes softening as if, for the first time in years, he was being allowed to unclench the knot in his chest. Thank you, not just for what you said, but for holding on to the part of me I thought had died. Angela offered a small smile, brushing off a crease on his coat sleeve like a mother would. Go. Do what you have to do, but don't forget to come back. Not everyone gets the chance to start over. Nathan nodded, tucked the envelope into the inner pocket of his jacket, and pulled her into a firm embrace before stepping out into the hallway. The cold air hit him hard, but something warm flickered in his chest, not from revenge, but from the quiet truth that, for the first time, someone other than Claire believed he had never completely lost the man he was meant to be. The late autumn wind whipped through the tangled alleys of Brooklyn as Nathan stepped out of the old subway station, his cold gaze sweeping over every familiar corner. Everything was the same, the smell of exhaust, the burnt bread drifting from the corner bakery, the blare of horns, and the walls peeling with rotted posters. But today was not an ordinary day. Today was the end. He stopped in front of an abandoned warehouse by the river, a place that had once been the drop point for Dominic's contraband for nearly 10 years. Now it was nothing but damp walls and dust settling across the concrete floor. Inside, Dominic was already waiting, long gray coat, neatly cut silver hair, one hand resting on a cane, his eyes still carrying that same fearlessness he had worn all his life. No bodyguards, no weapons, just the two of them. Nathan walked in and stopped a few meters away. "Didn't expect you to show up alone," Dominic said first, his voice dry as ash. "I'm here to finish this," Nathan replied, without circling around the truth. Dominic nodded slowly, narrowing his gaze. "You were always the most honest of them, and that's why you're the most dangerous. I know what you sent to the press, and I know Tony was arrested this morning in Miami. Fool thought he could escape?" Nathan said nothing, only stared, waiting for what was coming. Dominic stepped closer, each stride heavy but steady. "I know by now it's over. They'll turn on each other, spill everything. The empire your father and I built, the one we bled for, is burning because of one thing: conscience." He stopped in front of Nathan, and for the first time his eyes carried something strange, not regret, not anger, but surrender. "I don't blame you, because if I were you years ago, I would have done the same." Nathan clenched his fists. "Too many people died, Dominic. Lucia, my mother, dozens of innocent people. All because of the illusion of power you clung to." Dominic nodded, slow and deliberate. "And you think exposing everything will save your soul?" "No," Nathan answered, voice steady. "I'm not trying to save myself. I'm trying to save her." Dominic let out a thin smile. "Claire, I heard. The girl with the paintings and the autumn eyes. She's the one who made you turn on everything." Nathan didn't deny it. "She made me remember who I used to be." The wind hissed through the shattered window, spiraling dry leaves between two men who had once shared the same darkness. Dominic reached into his coat, pulling out an old phone and placing it in Nathan's hand. "There's a recording in here, between me and Tony, about the order to shoot you years ago. I kept it for insurance. Now it's yours. Send it to the FBI. Send it to whoever you want. I'm tired, and I don't intend to die in prison." Nathan looked at him, his eyes like steel. "I didn't come here to kill you, but you won't escape the law." Dominic gave a faint laugh and turned toward the back exit. "No one escapes fate, Nathan. Not even me." He stopped on the last step, still not looking back. "Take good care of her. And if you can, don't teach your child how to shoot." Then he stepped out, dissolving into the fog of a day nearing its end. Nathan stood there for a long moment, the phone still in his hand, his chest not lighter, but no longer afraid. The past no longer held him by the throat. He turned and walked back out to the street. Rain began to fall, cold and sharp against his skin. But he didn't stop. Vermont was waiting. Claire was waiting. And this time, nothing and no one would ever pull him back again, because everything was finally over. Boston's morning carried a crisp, gentle chill, and the sunlight drifting through the glass windows of Martinez Gallery wrapped everything in a soft golden sheen. Claire sat in the corner of the room, her hands cupping a mug of chamomile tea, her quiet gaze following the sparse foot traffic, moving along the street outside. On the table lay a white envelope stamped with the Montpelier Hospital seal, delivered earlier that morning. She hadn't opened it. Nathan stepped in from the back, his hands still speckled with white paint from repainting the steps outside the gallery. He froze when he saw her eyes fixed on the envelope, the tension etched clearly across her face. He didn't need to ask. He knew it was the 3-month follow-up result after her treatment. He walked over, pulled a chair beside her, and rested his hand over hers. "Want to open it together?" She nodded softly and handed him the envelope. Nathan's hand trembled slightly as he slid a finger along the seal and pulled out the thin stack of papers. He skimmed through the medical terms, his eyes moving quickly until they landed on the line that mattered most. No malignant cells detected in the blood. The tumor has significantly reduced. The treatment is responding well. He read it aloud, then fell silent. Claire didn't react at first, as if her mind needed a few more seconds to absorb what those words truly meant. Then suddenly, she broke down in tears, not from sorrow, but from a release so overwhelming and unexpected after months spent quietly preparing to say goodbye. Nathan pulled her into his arms instantly, holding her tightly against him, his voice trembling with relief as he whispered into her hair, "You did it. You're stronger than anyone I've ever known. You're still here." Claire clung to him, her tears soaking into his shirt. "I once thought I'd never see another spring, never see this gallery finished. Never see you like this." He cradled her head against his chest, their heartbeats settling into the same exhausted, grateful rhythm. "I used to think no one should ever choose to live for someone like me, but you made me understand that my life can have worth too." She looked up at him, her eyes still swollen but shining brighter than he had ever seen. "We were two people who lost our way. You came from the dark, and I came from despair. But somehow, we found each other. And I want to live, not because I was saved, but because I still have so many things I want to do." Nathan nodded, and in his eyes was a steady conviction he had never allowed himself to dream of. "You'll keep painting, keep teaching the kids, and I'm going to apply to college." Claire blinked, startled, pulling back slightly to see his face clearly. "Really?" Nathan nodded with a quiet smile. "I enrolled in courses for art and modern history, not because I want to become an artist, but because I want to understand the world you love. And if one day the kids in your class ask why a man who once lived by violence is teaching them how to mix colors, I want to have an honest answer." Claire let out a breathy laugh that dissolved into tears. "You don't have to prove anything, but if you go to school, I'll be the first one sitting in the front row." Nathan drew her close again, his fingers sliding gently through her hair. "I want to live a life you'll be proud to say you chose, not because I'm perfect, but because I had the courage to change." Outside, the spring breeze carried tiny flower petals from the tree across the street. On the table, the hospital results lay quietly, but in their hearts, it had already become a doorway opening into an entirely new chapter. Claire was no longer merely a patient. Nathan was no longer a man on the run. They were two people living for each other, with each other, and for something far greater than the past, the future. Nathan walked slowly along the cobblestone path leading to the gates of Emerson College, holding a neatly printed stack of admission papers, his palms slightly damp, though his eyes shone with a steadiness untouched by fear. For the first time in his life, he was going somewhere not because of an order, a mission, or a price paid in blood, but for himself, for a nameless dream that had begun the moment he saw Claire collapse in the street that first day. The campus buzzed with students rushing between buildings, many of them nearly 2 decades younger than him, yet he didn't feel out of place. All he felt was another version of himself rising from the ashes, step by step, decision by decision. When he returned to the gallery, Claire was standing before her easel, sunlight streaming through the glass windows and casting long shadows across the wooden floor. She turned when she heard him come in, her eyes bright with anticipation and curiosity. Nathan didn't speak right away. He simply approached, pulled out a chair, and sat down in front of her as though preparing for a conversation they had both been waiting for. "I submitted the application," he began, his voice low and even. "My first class is philosophy and Renaissance art. The professor looks terrifying, but I think I'm going to like it." Claire set her brush aside and sat across from him, her lips parting as though words hovered there but refused to fall. Nathan continued, his eyes steady on hers. "I lived almost 40 years as if I didn't exist, just a name in a file, a shadow that left no trace. But since meeting you, everything changed. You didn't just pull me out of my old life. You gave me a reason to exist." His voice softened. "I used to believe I didn't deserve anything good. I have killed. I have lied. I have betrayed. But you saw something in me I didn't even know was still alive. You didn't run when you learned the truth. You didn't flinch when you saw the darkness in me. You stayed. And because you stayed, I learned how to stop long enough to see who I really was." Claire squeezed his hand gently, her eyes already glistening. "I didn't save you, Nathan. I just stayed. You're the one who chose a different life." Nathan shook his head slightly. "No, you are the reason. The reason I'm still here. The reason I didn't pull the trigger that last time. The reason I came back from a place that, once entered, no one ever returns from. You made me want to become someone who can be trusted, someone who can be loved, and more than that, someone who can love without losing himself. Claire's tears spilled over, not from fear or sorrow, but because she felt seen completely, wholly down to the deepest part of who she was. You don't have to become someone new for me to love you, she whispered. I love the man who had the courage to face his past, who was strong enough to change. Nathan smiled softly and leaned in to press a kiss to her forehead. Then let me show you that every day, not with promises, not with the past, but with each step I take, each class I study, each frame I build for your paintings, each morning coffee, each tired evening when all I can do is sit beside you in silence. Because you are the only reason I ever learned what living truly means. Outside, the wind chime hanging on the gallery's porch jingled faintly in the afternoon breeze. There was no need for grand vows or dramatic declarations. Everything between them had already been proven through healed scars. Quiet mornings without nightmares, fingers intertwined as they walked through crowded streets, and a shared dream that didn't need to be extraordinary, only shared. Claire rested her head on his shoulder, closing her eyes, her heart filling with a peace she had never known. Nathan whispered, his voice barely more than a breath, almost a prayer. You are the reason I live, and I will live in a way worthy of that, every day, for as long as you're here, and even if one day you are not. Early morning in Boston, the clean air drifted through the open window, carrying the smell of toasted bread from the shop across the street and the lingering scent of chamomile tea from the kitchen. Claire stood at the easel near the window, the soft gold morning light resting over the painting she was finishing. It was a field of wildflowers stretching all the way to the horizon, where a man and a woman walked hand in hand, not needing to look back, not needing to know what tomorrow might bring, only knowing they were together in that small, perfect moment. Nathan came over, placed a warm cup of coffee in her hand, and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. He had just returned from his first class of the second semester at the university, his face bright with quiet pride yet still carrying the steadiness of someone who had lived far more lives than he should have. Claire looked at him and smiled softly. Mornings like this, for them, were a reward, unshowy, quiet, but filled with all the gratitude of two people who had once stood at the edge of a cliff and still chose to turn back. They didn't talk about forever. Neither of them made promises to stay together for the rest of their lives, but each day they lived as though today might be the last, and therefore the most important. Nathan helped Claire run the art class for neighborhood children. Some of the kids had lived through family turmoil, loss, and heartbreak, and through each session, each messy stroke of color, Claire taught them how to heal. Nathan taught them how to hold a brush properly, how to find colors through the light, and sometimes he simply sat beside a quiet child to let them know someone was willing to sit with them, even when no words were spoken. Some evenings, they cleaned the gallery after the last visitor had left, then sat together on the old wooden floor sharing a box of pizza while telling each other the small stories of their day. Claire talked about a little girl who painted a purple cat because purple was the color of strength. Nathan recounted something his philosophy professor had said, that every human being carries a shadow inside, but real light is choosing to live against it day after day. They laughed quietly, because no truth could describe their lives more accurately. Not everyone gets a chance to start over, but when they do, the important thing isn't running fast toward the future, it's daring to stop, to face oneself, and to live with the kindness one once believed they didn't deserve. Claire had once counted her breaths in a hospital room, believing death was the only certainty left. Nathan had once been a nameless shadow moving through cold and merciless crossfire, but now, they were people who did their grocery shopping on weekends, who brewed tea for each other, who framed new paintings in silence, who walked through crowded streets hand in hand, without fear of being recognized. This was home, not because of an address or papers, but because here, they were allowed to be themselves. Here, they were loved, forgiven, and able to live as the best versions of who they could be. Claire and Nathan's story may be just a small slice of a chaotic world, but it remains a gentle reminder that every person deserves a second chance. And when someone believes in us, even when we cannot believe in ourselves, it can change the entire shape of a life. Thank you for following this story to the end. How did you feel about Claire and Nathan's journey? Did anything in their story remind you of your own life? Please share your thoughts and feelings in the comments below. We truly hope to hear from your heart. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like, and share this video if it brought you something meaningful. We have many more emotional stories waiting for you in the episodes to come. Wishing you good health, peaceful days, and the strength to find something worth living for in every moment. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.